Morning. On behalf of the California ISO, I'd like to welcome you to the 2021 Interconnection Process Enhancements Phase 1 Initiative meeting to discuss the draft final proposal, which is posted on March 17th. My name is Brenda Corona, representing the Stakeholder Affairs Group here at the California ISO. I'll be facilitating today's meeting, and I'm also joined here by Danielle Tavo, Policy Specialist from Policy Development. This presentation and other materials related can be found on the initiative webpage. A few housekeeping reminders is that this video and recording will be posted on the initiative webpage for more information and conveniences purposes only. The recording and any related transcriptions should not be reprinted without the ISO's permission. This meeting is structured to stimulate dialogue and engage different perspectives. Please keep comments professional and respectful. Also, try to refrain from repeating what was already mentioned and to manage time effectively. And also, to raise your hand, we will pause for questions periodically throughout the meeting. You may raise your hand by selecting the hand icon above the chat window in WebEx. And if you joined audio, press #2 on your device. Also, before saying your comment, please state your name and affiliation first, and we will be monitoring all questions sent via chat to all panelists. If you do experience any technical assistance during the meeting, please send a chat to our event producer. On this graphic, we have the ISO stakeholder process, which is currently in the draft final proposal development phase of the stakeholder process. This presentation will review the next steps for the draft final proposal. And today's agenda, we will go ahead and kick it off with passing along to Danielle Tavo, who will kick off today's meeting for the Phase 1 process enhancement. Danielle, your line's still muted. We could go ahead and kick off the meeting.
Thanks. Good morning, everyone. Appreciate that, Brenda. Let's go ahead and move to the next slide, please. Thank you. So the Interconnection Process Enhancements, or the IPE initiative, is the ISO's ongoing commitment to continuous improvement to the generator interconnection and deliverability allocation procedures by making some appropriate enhancements as the environment for resource interconnection evolves. This initiative is really seeking to explore some solutions that fall into three main buckets. The first is addressing the fact that we need to meet the challenges facing timely, effective, reliable, and economic resource and transmission development. The second bucket is focused on resolving issues and creating enhancements to handle the accelerated pace of resource procurement and development that's needed over the next 5 to 10 years that might not align with our current interconnection processes. And finally, the third bucket is focused on issues that we've become aware of and need to be enhanced or adjusted on based on current circumstances since the last IPE initiative that was conducted back in 2018. So before we move on to the next slide, I think it's also important here to note that we don't want to address any of these issues in isolation. We think that all of these issues need to be addressed in coordination with each other to achieve a sustainable approach to resolving these issues. Let's move to the next slide, please. Thanks. So given the current supply conditions and the unprecedented procurement orders for the next at least 5 years, we've determined that this initiative has two distinct but simultaneously run phases. Phase 1, which is the focus of today's call, is focusing on the near-term enhancements to the existing interconnection processes that we can resolve, particularly related to the current queue overload compounded by Cluster 14. And then Phase 2 will focus on resolving the longer-term modifications and broader reforms to align interconnection processes with procurement activities. And these modifications or process reform considerations will work to achieve greater efficiencies and use of valuable planning and engineering expertise, and also reduce uncertainty in the development process. And that phase is targeting a completion before the start of Cluster 15 in April of 2023. We can go to the next slide. Thanks. Okay, so the primary focus of today's stakeholder call is on the draft final proposal for Phase 1 near-term enhancements, which are largely focused on items that we can resolve for Cluster 14. And these are mainly process enhancements. And as I mentioned previously, the other piece of the initiative is focused on Phase 2, but to make sure that we keep the Phase 1 proposal development on track, we are proposing to defer proposal development on Phase 2 items until June 6th of this year when we publish the draft final proposal specific to Phase 2. And likewise, there are a few additional items that are requiring some state agency coordination that we are proposing to address outside of the IPE process, as well as the data transparency topic, which will be addressed outside of IPE. And we want to take these outside of the stakeholder effort to allow for greater stakeholder discussion and collaboration and not detract from the progress we're making from the Phase 1 and Phase 2 items. And just so everyone's aware, we have scheduled the Data Transparency Stakeholder Workshop that we're looking forward to hosting on Tuesday, April 5th. And with that, I'll go ahead and pause here and see if there's any questions before handing it over to Linda.
As a reminder, if you're connected to the computer audio or use the Call Me feature in WebEx, you may enter the question queue by using the WebEx raise hand icon located just above the chat panel. You'll hear a beep tone when your line is unmuted. At that time, please state your name and question. If you're just on the phone line and not using the WebEx audio, please dial #2 on your phone to enter the question queue. You'll hear a notification when your line is unmuted. At that time, please state your name and question. I do see one caller in the queue. Please go ahead, your line is unmuted.
Hi, Sam Bustillos from STG&E. Just wondering if there's going to be something that's going to be posted to the stakeholder page or provided otherwise that indicates which items are being addressed in Phase 2 or what items are going to end up in the data transparency forum. There were just a couple items that we saw that weren't in the draft final proposal that were in the straw proposal. Thank you.
Yes, we will be posting something in advance of the Data Transparency Stakeholder Workshop to help provide a little context on what we're going to be discussing on the April 5th call. And as far as the issues that aren't included in this effort but will be included in Phase 2, we are planning on posting that draft final proposal on Phase 2 items on June 6th. And I should note here that the last iteration of this proposal was the revised straw proposal, which included efforts on both the Phase 1 side and the Phase 2 side. And we did try to make a specific note on which items are Phase 1 versus Phase 2. So I direct you to the revised straw proposal to identify which items will be included in that June 6th draft final proposal.
I do not see any other callers in the queue as of now.
Okay, great. I'll pass it over to Linda. Thank you.
Good morning, everybody. This is Linda Wright. Removing the downsizing window and simplifying the downsizing request requirements proposal remains the same. This item will remove the downsizing window that currently is in place. The project will be able to submit a downsizing request at any time via the MMA process. There were some concerns regarding the impact to the MMA process and in some of the comments. Historically, there have been very few or even no requests of this type submitted during the downsizing window, so the impact to the MMA process is expected to be minimal. Impacts to downsized projects with network upgrades will be determined in the next annual reassessment study process, and projects with no network upgrades will be able to have their GIAs amended without further study. Are there any questions?
Yes, I do see one caller in the queue. Please go ahead. Your line is unmuted.
Hi, Linda. Susan Schneider, Phoenix Consulting. Can you hear me okay?
I can. Thank you, Susan.
Hi. I just, there was a little bit of discussion about this at the last stakeholder meeting where it turned, if projects had network upgrades, but for example, if all the network upgrades were assigned to that project, or if they were otherwise, the ISO was otherwise able to fairly simply determine whether the downsizing process would be material or not, it's possible that that projects that had network upgrades possibly could still go through the MMA process here. Is that still on the table? I thought we were sort of moving in that direction, but I didn't see that in the proposal.
Well, if they have network upgrades, we'd have to check to make sure they don't impact other projects that are later in the queue.
Right.
So even if they assigned all to one project, does not mean necessarily they're not impacting other projects. So that would have to be looked at case-by-case basis.
Okay, so is it possible that some projects with network upgrades, if it was a fairly easy determination for the CAISO, that they could still be done through the MMA process?
Well, they're all going to go through the MMA process, as whether or not that they would also have to have the additional reassessment study.
Okay, so let me ask the question again differently. If it's possible for the CAISO to determine without going through the reassessment process, even if a project has network upgrades, could that still be addressed only through the MMA process? Is that a clearer question?
That sounds like it would be reasonable. They'll have to look at, but that would be on a case-by-case basis.
Okay, it would be good in the next version if you could put that in as a sort of a case, and you mentioned that it's a case-by-case thing, but instead of a black and white thing, if there's a little wiggle room in case there's a simple situation, it would just be good to know that.
Thanks, Susan.
Okay, thank you.
I do not see any other callers in the queue as of now.
Why don't we move to the next slide, please? All right, this is Steve Ruddy. I'm going to cover this item. And there was some confusion that we kind of gleaned from the comments. You know, this emergency generation process is not an open window where folks can just come to the ISO and apply when an emergency is stated by the state. The ISO is not going to be the procurement entity for these generators, a state agency is. The ISO is merely posing to codify the process to study and connect the generating facilities determined by the state to meet our emergency needs. So hopefully with that clarification, the ISO did not make any changes to our proposal. The ISO will accept emergency generation study requests only pursuant to a specific emergency state mandate and only for interconnections and additions specifically designated by a state agency, not including counties, municipalities, or CCAs. As we stated before, these generators cannot negatively impact the cost or timing of any queued project unless the impacted project belongs to the same developer and that developer agrees to the change. It cannot require network upgrades greater than 1 million or construction time of greater than 6 months. The interconnection service will be for no more than 3 years. And interim deliverability is possible, consistent with 4.6 of the GitApp. So if there is deliverability available, we can give it to this generator on an interim basis until those that are in line for that deliverability need it, and then we'll have to give it back to those who are in line for it first. A couple other aspects of this proposal is the ISO must agree that the interconnection is warranted, and the interconnection will mitigate a reliability risk. The interconnection customer will pay for the studies, and a $50,000 study deposit will be required. And because we anticipate these studies to go very quickly, we do not propose to put any study timelines in the tariff. So hopefully with those clarifications, again, the state identifies the resource needed and we merely are going to study it, and we just need to put it in our tariff so we can get that done and not have to continue to go to FERC for waiver requests. So with that, why don't we open it up to questions?
Sure. I do see a couple of callers in the queue. Moving on to the first caller. Ryan Cordo, your line is unmuted.
Thank you so much. Good morning, Steve, and thanks for taking my question this morning. This is Rayanne Quadro with EDF Consulting today.
Good morning, Rayanne.
I wanted, yeah, it's early. Earlier this month, the CPUC sent a letter to the IOUs requesting prioritized action on some critical electric generating projects that they defined in the letter. Was that the sort of action that would lead the CAISO to trigger this emergency generator process, or would it have to be something closer than to last year's item with a CDWR?
It would have to be an emergency that we have identified where we're going to most likely enter into reliability issues.
Okay.
And the governor or state agency would have to designate it.
Thank you
Bill,
so much
do you
for
have
that
anything
clarification.
you want to add to that?
Yeah, I mean, it's always going to be a case-by-case call, but I agree with Steve. I think it'd be much closer to, the CDWR case. It's never going to be a developer coming to us. We're just going to ignore those, calls. It needs to be, the state agency itself saying, study this interconnection, please. We need it immediately.
So, but the CPUC, I think, is a state agency, which is kind of where I was trying to get the distinction here.
Oh, yeah. I mean, yeah, and it could be the CPUC, but I mean, here it just sounds like a general vague procurement rather than a specific, them coming to us saying, study X.
Sure. Okay, thank you so much.
Moving on to the next caller. Kathleen Colbert, your line is unmuted. Please go ahead.
Great, no, thank you. This is Kathleen Colbert from Vistra. I want to thank Steve for you going through and talking through your intent behind this and giving us clarifications. We've put this in our comments. I think we've been open about the fact that we frown upon the state kind of taking these actions to allow for projects to leapfrog others or to queue jump. But I want to acknowledge that we appreciate you taking the time to put this in the tariff in a way that it puts some more structure around how the CAISO would operate in the event that does happen. It's an incremental improvement to at least have this kind of structure around it. That said, we are still nervous about kind of there not being quite enough of a firm line, like you just talked about with Rayanne. And so we'll put this in our written comments, but we'd like to request that the policy here be that it requires a state emergency proclamation and not just an informal or ask from a state regulator, really in the mind of, you understand you want to do this. If the governor issues an emergency proclamation, then that could trigger this tariff language, but it wouldn't be so ambiguous on other types of actions. I think that would provide a little bit more structure to make us even more comfortable with this as something that's needed to go in the tariff. I'm happy to see if you have any feedback on that before I ask make my last comment.
Okay, thanks, Kathleen. Appreciate that. I'll look forward to that in your comments. And Bill, do you have any concern over that aspect?
No, I think that's pretty much what we already have. And I don't think there's any queue jumping here too, because if you look at the criteria, anyone that would have any impact on an existing queue customer, is going to get rejected regardless of whatever proclamation or emergency is happening, right? I mean, that's one of the clear criteria is that there can't be a negative impact on any queued customer.
No, I appreciate that. So Bill, let me lean in because my last question gets at just trying to assuage my, our own concerns that isn't happening here. So that feedback is helpful. My second question is about, is about, okay, the interim deliverability that you mentioned that you would pull back and reallocate to those who had been in line for it previously. I was wondering if you could put a little bit more context on that, just from a process perspective, so that we could get more comfortable with what this means. Like, for example, am I to understand that this, when we go through the transmission plan deliverability allocation, we have capability as you have the amount of headroom available to allocate for TPD, and any that had previously been allocated on an interim basis to these types of projects would not be considered as having that, and so it would almost go back into the TPD allocation? Is that what we're saying here?
I lost you on your hypothetical, but interim deliverability, I mean, the way it works now is simply that there is just available deliverability that no one is using, usually because certain delivery network upgrades were constructed before the generator that triggered them has come online, right? And if, some other generator comes by and can use that deliverability, we say, great, you can, borrow this deliverability until the generator that triggered it, any generators that financed it, when they come online, you instantly, lose this interim deliverability, and it goes to, the correct generator.
So in my hypothetical, I was asking if the generator that had triggered that needs the deliverability can get it allocated at the time that the TPD is allocated. But I think your clarification is we would still be eligible if we were the ones triggering it to receive our TPD allocation without any issues. The resource with interim deliverability would continue to operate with that until we achieve our COD with the TPD that we have.
I think, yes, I feel like it's an easier way to say that, but yeah,
I'm sure there is, and if there is, if you could put a little bit of extra clarity in your next in the final proposal on that. I think my concern here, I just want to make sure is not present, is that it does not impact any projects that are in the queue today to seek their TPD and then achieve commercial operations with that full capacity.
Yeah, that's definitely true. That's in the tariff now. We're not making any policy changes to how interim deliverability works.
Okay, great. Thank you for that clarification. I think that's what I'm looking for. Thanks.
Okay, moving on to the next caller. Alan, please go ahead. Your line is unmuted.
Yeah, hi. This is Alan Combs. Can you hear me okay?
Yeah, we can.
Yeah, great. So construction greater than 6 months, I understand that the applicant can make the case that they can make and beyond within 6 months, but how does the CAISO determine whether, I assume by construction you also include any upgrades or equipment required by the PTO? How is the CAISO going to evaluate that?
Well, with the best information.
This is criteria to apply, so how are you going to evaluate that in the application context?
Well, remember, this generation needed very quickly in an emergency state, so we're going to evaluate the totality of how to get that generator connected, and if we can't get it connected within 6 months by construction of either the generator or the interconnection facilities, then it's not it won't be a project that's going to work.
Well, I'm sort of asking a pragmatic question. I've never seen a PTO say they can do anything in less than 6 months. They can't even create a project in about, it takes them months to create even a project and assemble a team, but so in an application point of view, I assume you're going to confer with the PTO, but I think how is that going to get communicated or be made transparent? I mean, I really think we're somewhat held to the PTOs and having no idea what it's going to take them to even like install a meter or what, I could list a bunch of things that I think take less than 6 months, but what's the generator to do if the PTO simply says they can't do it? And isn't that the purpose of the application, to kind of evaluate that? Where I'm getting is, I don't know why that should be a criteria to apply.
Well,
I mean, are you going to confer with the PTO before you even, I mean, this is the part I don't understand. It seems like you should apply and then confer with the PTO.
No, there's going to be a lot of communication going on between all the parties for this type of a request that's going to come in. It's to allow us to interconnect a generator that can meet the state's needs in a very quick manner. Most likely it's going to be in addition to an existing plant where there are not going to be any new interconnection facilities required. I believe that's how it was used last year. So if it requires a substation or a gen-tie or any of that kind of stuff, it's probably not going to be a project that meets these criteria.
I'll just clarify that I'm not even talking about that. I'm talking about even like re-rating a meter and doing a protection review. But I'll just leave it at that. All I'm saying is I don't think it should be a gating item to make the request. If you could just clarify that that's not part of the proposal, that'd be fine. But even like adjusting a meter to accept more megawatts, could be if that's a high bar to meet on it, and also that it just seems like that shouldn't be a criteria to apply. I'll just put it that way. Thank you.
Bill, do you have any?
I think we disagree. Experience with the Greenleaf shows us that we can get, a substantial number of megawatts much quicker than 6 months. And as Steve said, if it's a true emergency, then it can't take that long. And I think we want this criteria as a signaling mechanism, not to the applicant so much. I mean, remember, it's not really the developer that's coming to us. We want this as a signaling mechanism to the agencies that would be doing the procurement, that would be trying to pick these generators, to say, anything that's going to be longer than 6 months, we have other tariff mechanisms for that. This is for real emergencies that can be interconnected rapidly, and similar to what we did last year.
Thank you.
Moving on to the next caller. Brindavani Malladi, please go ahead. Your line is unmuted.
Thank you. Good morning, everyone. This is Brinda Malladi from Ariwan. I had a quick question on this process. Do you see this impacting the deliverability of existing projects that are in the queue?
No. That's one of the criteria. The only deliverability we're going to apply here is interim, which is defined in our tariff already. So it's not going to impact any current queued deliverability allocation.
Okay, thanks.
Okay, I do not see any other callers in the queue as of now.
Okay, thank you. I think we're moving on to Bob Emmerich.
Hey, Steve, this is Bob Emmerich. So this slide is addressing the revised site exclusivity requirement. And in the draft final proposal, we made a few tweaks to it, and we also combined with the phase one proposal that was related to what the requirements were for entering into phase two. And we combined what was prior part of a phase two item, which is the deposit for site exclusivity. So we felt it was best to bring that into this proposal since they're so closely tied together. And the biggest change that we made in the draft final proposal was this item for cluster 14, where the cluster 14 requirements to enter into phase two was modified to allow site exclusivity deposit rather than require full site exclusivity demonstration to be able to get into phase two. But the process does put site exclusivity deposit at risk if you do proceed into phase two without having demonstrated site exclusivity, where the entire amount of this site exclusivity deposit is non-refundable if a project withdraws after having made its initial interconnection financial security posting to move into phase two. And then the remaining items are pretty much the same, other than we're just bringing in the items for what the new deposit will be. Starting with cluster 15 and beyond, we are increasing the deposit in lieu of site exclusivity to $250,000 for small projects, small generators, and increasing for large generators the amount to $500,000. And 50% of the site exclusivity deposit will be at risk 31 days after a project scoping meeting. So where currently, if a project withdraws within 30 days after a scoping meeting, they can get their study deposit back, anything that's not been spent. So within that same category, we're saying you can get your site exclusivity back within 30 days after the scoping meeting. But after that point in time, if a project withdraws, they can lose 50% of their site exclusivity. And demonstration of site exclusivity will be required to enter into the phase two studies. In all cases, a demonstration of site exclusivity prior to withdrawal results in 100% of the site exclusivity deposit being returned to the interconnection customer. And we will be modifying the definition of site exclusivity in the ISO Tariff Appendix A, and that will be presented with the proposed changes to Appendix DD tariff changes. We are planning to bring in specific requirements related to offshore wind and Bureau of Land Management cited projects and include those specifics in the BPM. We felt that it would be better to put those in the BPM where it'd be easier to make adjustments to those in the future. In particular for offshore wind, we are just going to be seeing in this year for the first time likely some offshore wind leases that are put out by the Bureau of Ocean Energy Management. And as time goes on, we may want to adjust that process to fit actually how it plays out, if it plays out a little bit differently than we expect at this point in time. So we feel that BPM is the best place to put that more specific information. So at this point, I'll open it up for questions.
As a reminder, if you are connected to the computer audio or use the Call Me feature in WebEx, you may enter the question queue by using the WebEx raise hand icon located just above the chat panel. You'll hear a beep tone when your line is unmuted. At that time, please state your name and question. If you're just on the phone line and not using the WebEx audio, please dial #2 on your phone to enter the question queue. You'll hear a notification when your line is unmuted. At that time, please state your name and question.
Okay, moving on to the next slide. So this slide deals with the transmission plan deliverability allocation process. And there were some fairly significant changes done in the draft final proposal. The revised straw proposal did include the items under the first bullet, and these items have not changed, where stakeholders were supporting the simplification and reordering of allocation groups 1 through 3, where group 1 is for active projects or projects that are operational and demonstrating that they have an executed PPA. And group 2 are all projects that are either active or in operation that are currently shortlisted for a PPA, and group 3 is for any project that has achieved commercial operation regardless of its deliverability status. The big change came in the draft final proposal related to, we added a new group 4 where we got significant stakeholder responses pushing back on us getting or doing away with the current allocation group 3. And in considering those comments and also thinking about that trying to find a way to better align our process with the procurement process, that if we were able to provide deliverability to projects going into a PPA request for offers, that would help the procurement process have a better understanding that which projects they should procure, and the ones that they actually sign PPAs with, they would actually have a better understanding, do they have deliverability or not, rather than waiting for the allocation process to tell them that. So we are proposing a new group 4, and it's somewhat of a revised version of the current allocation group 3. We are allowing any project to be eligible by removing the current allocation group 3 requirement where the project must attest that it is going to proceed without a PPA. So that will no longer be a requirement. And we are modifying the group 3 restrictions, easing when projects can apply, but increasing the restrictions on projects selecting group 4. We're also related to the PPA requiring deliverability must be with the off-taker. We made an adjustment to this where we are still requiring that the PPA that requires deliverability must be with an off-taker that has an RA obligation, or the change is that if the project can demonstrate that there is a contract that actually sells the RA attributes of the project to an off-taker with an RA obligation, such as the project or the off-taker that procures everything from the project, but they don't have an RA obligation. But if that entity can actually demonstrate they have a contract with a load-serving entity that has an RA obligation, and that contract is for 5 years or more, we will accept that. So the key here is we would have to see documentation of a contract that ties that RA attributes to a load-serving entity that has an RA obligation. And then for PPAs requiring delivery, they must procure the RA capacity for 5 years. And one thing we did adjust on that is that will be beginning with the allocation group that begins in the 2023 timeframe. So for the allocation that begins in 2022, just for 1 year, we will allow contracts to be eligible if the RA attributes are only procured for 1 year. But starting in 2023, the 5-year requirement will take place. So with that, I'd like to spend a little bit more time on going through some explanations of allocation group 4 to really make sure everybody understands how allocation group 4 was formed and what the requirements are of that. So any project that does not have an allocation in TPD may apply for an allocation during the 2022 and to 2023 allocation cycle. That means projects that are energy only or full capacity delivery status. But beginning in the 2023 to 2024 TPD allocation cycle, only projects that are full capacity or partial capacity will be eligible to seek an allocation through Group 4. No energy-only projects will be eligible for Group 4 from that point forward. If a Group 4 project receives an allocation, it must accept the allocation or withdraw. If a Group 4 project does not receive an allocation, it may park, if eligible, and apply under Group 4 a second time. A project can come out of either its first or second year parking and apply under Group 4 for the first time. So currently in Group 3, you can only apply for it right after the phase 2. And if you don't apply for it in that first allocation cycle, you can't apply for it the next year. In this case, as long as you are still full capacity delivery status and you can come out of parking, you can request to get an allocation under Group 4. This will allow projects that are not ready to take on the Group 4 restrictions at the first opportunity to apply into Group 4 at a later date. Projects have up to 2 consecutive opportunities to seek an allocation after the Phase 2 study is completed. If after exhausting its parking opportunities, an allocation Group 4 project has either never received an allocation or has received an allocation but was not able to retain it, the project would be required to withdraw. We propose this as a means to keep the queue from getting clogged up with energy-only projects that are less viable and not moving forward. Once a project seeks an allocation in the Group 4, it will be subject to the following Group 4 restrictions. Projects may not request a suspension under its GIA. Projects cannot delay providing its notice to proceed as specified in the GIA, or modify its commercial operation date except to accelerate its COD to an earlier date. Interconnection customers that fail to proceed toward their COD as specified in their GIA will be withdrawn. So with that, I will open it up to questions.
We have 3 questions in queue. Raymond, your line is unmuted. Please state your name and affiliation.
Good morning. This is Rayanne Quadro on behalf of EDF. Thank you so much for the shift in policy. EDFR really appreciates it. There were a lot of concerns about marketing and data transparency with the previous proposal, and it's my opinion that this proposal is really complementary to the existing process as well as to those concerns. So thank you so much for that. My questions are a little more detailed. Bob, you said that if a project receives an allocation and does not take it, they must withdraw. Does that apply to partial allocations as well?
Yes.
Okay, so is there any threshold for that? If a 20 megawatt storage project receives a 1 megawatt allocation, they need to move forward with that 1 megawatt or withdraw?
Well, we haven't actually considered putting in some sort of a threshold. So why don't you put that in your comments and we'll consider that.
Sure. Yeah, just to clarify my thinking on this, thinking about like these edge cases, right? It seems like 1 megawatt is not really a marketable proposal from a development standpoint. So maybe there's a percentage or something, but I will take it back to the team and see if we could propose some sort of threshold. I appreciate your consideration.
Yeah, just to be clear though, that type of process is already going on with allocation Group 3. And I don't recall it ever coming up, being that type of an allocation. I don't know what our, kind of our threshold of the minimum amount that we can allocate out. I don't know that we can actually allocate, 1 megawatt, but that's just an example. But there may be, kind of a minimum amount. I remember having conversations about this in the past that, kind of the granularity that the engineers can get to is probably closer to, I recall something like 50 megawatts. So I don't think we'd ever be allocating out a very, very small amount.
Yeah, I'll be honest. I don't know if that's ever happened. Not something that's come across my desk recently, but I did want to kind of think it through. So I appreciate you entertaining that line of thought. And I think that is the only question I have for this one. So thank you so much for your time, and thank you so much for shifting the proposal.
Sure, thank you.
Next caller, Susan Schneider. Your line is unmuted. Please state your name and affiliation. Thank you.
Yeah, hi, Susan Schneider, Phoenix Consulting again. Yeah, thank you again for responding to stakeholder sentiment in this area. I do also have a couple of detailed questions. There's a statement, and I'm sort of looking at page 10 of the proposal, and I think you said it as well. Any project that does not have an allocation of TPD may apply for an allocation during the 2022-2023 TPD allocation cycle. Now, is that really any project? I mean, any project that is, is in the queue for a long time, any project that is is already operating, any project. So you don't have, I mean, I understand you maybe don't have to do it right coming off the study cycle, but any project at all that's in the queue that doesn't have a TPD allocation can come in and apply for this.
Yes, that's the intention for the first year.
Okay, and then, and even if they may have parked before or not, or decided not to park, if they come in and ask for this and they don't get an allocation, they can still park again?
No. If you've been through your parking opportunities and have exhausted those, there is no opportunity to jump back into parking again.
Okay, so if a project has parked for 2 years, obviously that means that they can't do it again. If a project has only parked for 1 year, can they park another year?
If eligible, yes, but only if eligible, and the eligibility for parking a second year will not be changing.
Okay, that makes sense. All right, so why is it then that in the 2022-2023 cycle, any project can apply no matter what their current deliverability status is, but for 2023 and 2024, only projects that are FCDS or PCDS can apply? Why is that? Why is there a change there?
Well, we wanted to kind of do a transition to where projects that may not in the past been willing to make the attestation that I'm going to move forward without a PPA, give them an opportunity to actually go down this track of trying to get an allocation and marketing their project. But that would be on a one-time basis. And then after that, we wanted to just limit it to projects that are still full capacity in this particular allocation group. We still have, allocation groups 1 and 2 energy-only projects can come into those groups if they get a PPA or shortlisted, but we wanted to make this allocation group 4 fairly restrictive.
Okay, I guess I'm still not clear, and maybe you can explain it a little more in the next version, why the change. So for energy-only projects, it's sort of just a one-time deal. You can only come in the first cycle, but somehow you're not eligible for the second. I'm not quite clear. I get that, especially because you have, in fact, you have the footnote here that says if because you haven't, if you're energy only, you only get sort of leftover space in the LDNUs after the projects that have, been studied to have FCDS or PCDS status. So anyway, that could be a little bit better explained because I'm still not quite sure I get that. And then can I ask a question also? Is a project, because this is similar, LSA had suggested, I think in our workshop to have a group 3 with a little more restrictions. So this is not too far from it, but is it I couldn't tell from the discussion in the proposal whether a project that gets this kind of allocation is then required. It sounds like they're required to come back in the next year with an executed PPA. Is that right?
That's correct.
Or they're not required.
Yeah, I think the retention requirements are in the paper. So yeah, a project that gets any project in any group that gets an allocation must come back the next year and meet whatever its retention criteria are. So in this case, okay, whether they get a PPA or shortlist, they have to meet those type of requirements.
Okay, but if they get a group 4 allocation, can they come back the next year with a short list, or can they come back? Do they have to come back with a PPA again? I did read it in the proposal, and I just wasn't really clear on it.
Yeah, they can come in with either being shortlisted or actually an executed PPA, and then proceed from that point forward in the retention process.
Okay, so they would get their TPD allocation, and then the next year they don't have to have a PPA executed. They can come back with a short list or active negotiations. And then the following year, they have to come back with a PPA. Is that the way that would work?
That's correct.
Okay, because I thought there was a discussion in some language in the proposal that talked about not wanting to stretch it out. And so it wasn't clear that was what you were actually saying. So I think that could probably be just clarified a little bit in the next iteration as well.
Yeah, to be clear, what we didn't want to stretch out was the time period that a project that gets an allocation through Group 4 would be able to hold on to that allocation before it was required to go through its retention process. We had considered allowing a project to get an allocation and then give them 2 years to go out and market it. without having to go into the retention process. But we came to the conclusion that we think it's pretty likely that enough projects will utilize Group 4 in such that most of the deliverability will be allocated out. And so if we initiate this in 2022, the next cluster after that will be that comes in that could seek an allocation for the first time. There may not be anything to allocate that year. So we came to the conclusion it's best to require projects to retain their allocation by whatever means that they got, if it's shortlisted or PPA, the very following allocation cycle, to where if they cannot retain it because they did get a PPA or they were shortlisted, they will lose their allocation. But if they're in their first year of going through Group 4, and they did have the opportunity to seek an allocation again, they can seek an allocation again, but they will lose it if they can't retain it.
Okay, but I understand the Group 2 retention because that's the same. But I was just trying to clarify that the Group 4 retention requirements are simply that the following year you come back shortlisted or in active negotiations, and then you don't need a PPA till the year after that.
That's for shortlisted. Yeah, that's the same for all projects that get an allocation through a shortlist.
Okay, but it's not an allocation through a short. Group 4 is not an allocation through a shortlist. You don't need a shortlist to get this allocation, right? You just go in and ask for the allocation.
Well, you do need it to retain it.
Okay, well that's my question. Is the retention is not the same as Group 2? It's that you have to come in the following year with the shortlist or active negotiations, and then the year after that you have to come back with a PPA, right?
Right.
Okay, thank you. And I'll tell you, it's not exactly that clear in the proposal, but I do appreciate your clarifying it here. So that's all my questions here.
Okay.
Next, we have Chris Devon, CES.
Can you hear me all right? This is Chris Devon from Customized Energy Solutions.
Yes.
Okay. So, Bob, I'm just wondering, since Tesla's not going to be doing the PPA retention criteria piece of this, then what would happen with the TPD allocation if your PPA gets terminated? And then is there a possibility that the customer could substitute in a new PPA at that point?
I think we have, we don't plan on changing that process. And I think we have allowed that if someone came in with a short list with a particular load serving entity, and that's how they got their allocation. And then the next year to retain it, they needed an executed PPA, but they got an executed PPA, but with somebody different. We would accept that.
Okay, I think that clarifies.
And kind of towards yours, if you said, where someone actually had an executed PPA, but for some reason lost it, but then came back the next period where they now have a PPA with somebody else. Well, actually, to back up on that, within this process, we are proposing that we are not requiring, we will not continue through the retention process to the point that we will require a regulatory approved PPA. Once you have an executed PPA, we're going to say, okay, that's good, and we're going to stop the retention process after that. And then just allow, the normal GIA type processes to determine if a project can continue to move forward or not. So if someone loses their PPA after they've gotten an allocation, if, in this case where they retained it because they got a PPA, we're not going to go back and check that PPA year after year.
Okay, so once they've already executed it, then, you're basically just relying on the GIA, and there's nothing that says they have to come back and say, hey, my PPA actually got terminated. To come back and show you another new PPA in the same time frame for the next year.
That's correct.
Okay, perfect. Thank you.
Next, we have Ian Kearney. Your line is unmuted. Ian, you might be double muted. Please check your device.
Please unmute the line from your end and proceed with your question.
We will get back to Ian. Next person on call is Kathleen Colbert.
Hi, great. No, thank you. This is Kathleen Colbert from Vistra. First, I want to thank the CAISO staff for thoughtfully considering stakeholder feedback on the last call and then also in her comments, and approaching the policy in a way to add the ability for projects not seeking through groups 1 through 3 as you have here, but adding this new group 4. Vistra really appreciates this. This is something that we, from a commercial perspective, we believe is an option that needs to be there. And so we just wanted to say thank you for updating your policy here. I have a very basic question, but I just wanted to make sure I was capturing this correctly while I was listening to you. So I heard, and I heard you mention that when Group 4 receives an allocation, it must either accept that allocation, whether it's maybe not 1 megawatt, but some, putting that issue aside, but accept that allocation or withdraw. But then we also talked about the ability to park for 2 times and essentially get recracks at TPD allocation, even if you're in Group 4. So I just wanted to see if you could marry those 2 concepts and clarify for the group that when you say accept the allocation or withdraw, you don't really mean that as binarily. You could also receive an allocation that's not full park and then have an opportunity to seek the TPD again in the next year, or if you really mean it is a binary choice at that point, there's no more parking.
Well, it's going to be pretty much the way we do it with any project, that if you receive a partial allocation, you must accept that partial allocation, but the remaining part of your project, you could park and seek another allocation for the remainder in the next allocation cycle. If you are out of opportunities to park and seek another allocation, then that remaining portion of your project would be converted to energy only. And then you can decide what to do if you want to, at that point, continue as partial capacity delivery status or downsize to become full capacity delivery status.
Great. Thank you, Bob, for going through that just one more time. I appreciate it. I just wanted to clarify there wasn't a change to the ability to continue to seek it for amounts that you didn't receive. Thank you.
Operator, let's try to unmute Ian Kearney for his question. Ian Kearney. Thank you.
Hi, can you hear me this time?
Yes, we can.
All right, great. Hi, Ian Kearney speaking on behalf of Golden State Clean Energy. I have a few questions on this slide, so apologies for that, but I'll try to tick through it quickly. And I think some I had to exit out, so I think Kathleen was just asking some, but I missed that, so apologies if I asked duplicates. There was a quote in the paper regarding the eligibility for Group 4 this fall that said that you would need an or any project that does not have an allocation would qualify. But does PCDS, is that eligible this fall?
So yes.
Okay.
Yeah, if you're PCDS, yeah, both full capacity or PCDS or energy only. Any projects are eligible this coming fall on a one-time basis.
Okay. And then moving on to the next fall, starting in 2023 and after that, it says that you need to have PCDS or FCDS to be eligible. Can you explain the why reference FCDS there if you're talking about eligibility for seeking additional deliverability?
Well, what we're saying is projects that would be eligible to come into Group 4, to seek an allocation to Group 4, must have some level of deliverability available to them. We won't be studying projects that are energy only to see if there's any leftover deliverability to be allocated to them. So we'll only allocate to that portion of the project that is either full capacity or partial capacity.
Got it. So then if you are just completing your phase 2 studies and seeking for the first time, you're not eligible for Group 4?
No, you are eligible as long as you are, you still have full capacity or partial capacity status. Even if you've parked for a year and haven't applied under Group 4, you can come in after parking, even after your second year parking, and apply for it. So anytime after you've completed your phase 2 studies, and as long as you are still full capacity or partial capacity, you are eligible for Group 4.
Got it.
Yeah,
So right when you
is what we're really saying that you haven't been converted to energy only yet? I mean, is that an easier way to put it?
That's another way of putting it, yes.
Okay, yeah, thank you for that. That was kind of what I was thinking, but yeah, I was a little confused given you don't actually have deliverability when you just complete phase 2. But that helps with the clarification, thank you. And then on the withdrawal requirements for Group 4, the paper's saying that you'll need deliverability to apply to Group 4 starting in fall 2023. But then if you apply twice and you don't have any deliverability or withdrawn, so can you explain how you'd be withdrawn if you need deliverability to apply? I guess maybe that goes back to what we just talked about, where you can apply right after phase 2 or after parking.
Yeah, the eligibility is related to what is your delivery status of your project. Are you full capacity or partial capacity, or are you energy only? So starting in 2023, if you have a status that you've requested that is still valid, you haven't been converted to energy only, you can apply to Group 4.
Okay. All right. And then on the treatment of like co-located and hybrid resources in Group 4, for co-located, let's say you only have enough deliverability for one component, that would be viewed as, and if it's all allocated to one component, that would be viewed as one component being FCDS, and then the other component would be energy only, correct? Not PCDS for the combination of the units?
Well, let me just say that we won't change it from the way we're doing it today. It'll be the same. So however we treat it today, we'll continue to go down that road. And I think there are some options around how that plays out. But frankly, I'm not quite so familiar with all those options and what we actually do allow and what we don't allow in that area. But it won't change from what we do today.
Okay. So I'm thinking in a scenario where you have co-located resources, one component is fully deliverable, the other is energy only, and we're talking, fall 2023, where you now need deliverability to apply to Group 4. Does that with that energy only?
Adjust you keep saying you need deliverability to apply. You don't need deliverability. You need to have your either full capacity or partial capacity status still in place. So you don't have deliverability until you actually get an allocation, but your delivery status still needs to be intact as either full capacity or partial capacity.
Okay, right, yeah. I need to correct my thinking on that given our previous discussion, but yeah, I appreciate that. So say you've been in the queue for a little while, so you're not coming off of phase 2 or parking, and you have an energy only component. So it's been converted to energy only, I guess. So that specific component then wouldn't be eligible starting in 2023 for Group 4. It couldn't back off the fact that the other co-located part has deliverability?
That's correct.
Okay. And then in that same scenario, one component's converted to energy only. It seeks Group 4 twice, doesn't get deliverability, strikes out. there's this withdrawal requirement. So would it mean that that co-located component would be required to withdraw?
No, I don't think that's the case. If a project gets partial delivery status, we're not, the part that got it can continue to move forward, and we're not going to require a project to actually withdraw the portion that ended up as energy only.
Okay. I mean, that it seems clear to me if it's a hybrid where the whole resource is being viewed as partial capacity deliverability status. But if it's two parts and one's energy only, if that was a standalone resource and it went through, it's converted to energy only, then struck out in the two attempts on group 4, it'd be withdrawn. But if it's co-located, my understanding is that's energy only, not partial capacity deliverability status. So then, would you get protection, I guess, from the withdrawal?
Yeah,
This is Bill. I would just say, resources aren't co-located or hybrid until they're coming online. That's not a distinction until you get to the new resource implementation process.
So then they're all PCDS if it's a mixed fuel project until you get to the NRI and make that determination.
Yeah, that's right. But as Bob said, there are a number of options because, we want to work with the developer, because we understand PCDS can have marketing issues. So, there are ways to phase the project or split it up such that, you can consider the X component essentially fully deliverable and the other portion energy only. But yeah, the generating facility as a whole would be PCDS.
Okay, great. Yeah, just ejecting part of the project seems difficult, and then it especially seems undesirable if you're going to kick out the whole project if part of it has deliverability. But that your explanation makes sense to me. And then on the retention criteria, all this new PPA eligibility criteria being discussed applies to Group 4 and Group 2 retention, correct?
Yes. For Group 4, if you have an allocation, so you get it your first year, by the following year, you have to be able to demonstrate that you either have a PPA or shortlisted at that point. And then once you've made that demonstration to be able to retain it, then the retention from that point forward are just like Group 1 or Group 2.
Okay, which requires minimum 5 years and all that.
Right.
There's a reference in the paper to giving priority to PPAs with LSEs over like a corporate PPA. Is that alluding to the point system changes that are going to occur in the BPM process?
Yes.
Okay.
I wouldn't necessarily say it would be points though, but that will be kind of a threshold item to where we will split the PPAs into two groups if we have some that are where the PPAs with an off-taker that doesn't have an RA requirement, they would be in the lower group and they would be all scored together. Those that have a PPA with an off-taker that was an RA requirement would all be scored in a group together as well. And so you'd allocate through the first group, and then whatever's left over would be allocated through the second group.
Okay, so more of a 1A, 1B situation than the kind of existing point system. Okay. And then you're not implementing that minimum term this fall, essentially. Can you confirm that, that delay in implementation is applicable to like a corporate PPA that's then resold to an LSE? It would also not have to have the 5-year minimum this fall.
Yes, we've been told that certain entities have been in negotiations for a contract where the RA component of it is only a 1-year contract, and we didn't want to necessarily derail those contracts. So for the first year, any kind of contract that requires, the requirement for RA is only going to be for 1 year, regardless of the type of contract that it is.
Okay. And then can you just explain a little bit the thinking on that 5-year requirement? What's the policy intent of 5 years? I appreciate the intent behind putting some sort of minimum there, but I'm still struggling to understand where the 5-year number came from.
Well, it was something that we felt was a reasonable minimum. It sounds like you say you understand the need for some level of minimum requirement. And we came up with, we talked about maybe even doing 10 years, but we thought, well, that's probably going a little bit too far, but we ought to start off with 5. And we haven't heard stakeholders say, well, no, we want to do something specific other than 1. Either, they wanted us to drop down to 1, which we weren't willing to do that. So not hearing any other proposals, we decided to stick with 5 years.
Okay. I think we talked about how 3 could be a reasonable ground, but yeah, I don't think we came down as clearly as promoting that. I think we kind of just raised some concern with 5 being a form of a barrier. So if there's still interest in potentially looking between 1 and 5 years, take that back and think about that. And I have one final question then on the minimum contract term length. Does it matter, the term, when the term begins relative to when the deliverability is sought? So like in an example, you have this 5-year term length, but you start seeking deliverability and you're not getting it, and maybe the resource is already online, so the contract's operating. You can envision eating into that 5-year term length, and so really you have 3 years left, but you have this contract for 5 years. So would that contract then become ineligible for Group 1?
Well, frankly, I hadn't considered that until just now. So why don't you put that in your comments, and we'll consider that if, based on your comments are.
All right, will do. And that was all my questions. Thank you very much.
Next, we have Shane O'Brien. Your line is unmuted.
Please unmute the device from your end and proceed with your question.
Yeah, can you hear me now?
Yes.
Wow, this is Shane O'Brien with IPA Power. I just had a question about, there's 2 paragraphs, talking about this TPD allocation. The first paragraph is, was just kind of being referenced there about, the ability for a project to park. Once the project parks, parking opportunities have been exhausted, then it's converted to energy only. But then the following paragraph, is discussing about if the project doesn't receive an allocation for 2 cycles, the project would be withdrawn. So it seems like those 2 statements are in slight conflict with each other. Could you help me understand how that would play out?
Yeah, I kind of recognized that myself when I reread that I was really trying to just discuss how projects that come into the first group could actually apply, that if projects that had been converted to energy only could apply in the first allocation cycle. But then starting in the allocation cycle that begins in, typically December of 2023, with then allocations happening in 2024, those would not be able to be energy only projects. And so that's the intent.
I think you need that additional clarification over the timeframes here, like you included in some of the other sections. And I guess that if that's the intention behind this, I'd like to echo our earlier concern that, if a project were to receive a relatively small portion of partial capacity, it seems against the intention of this change to, require the entire project to withdraw. If the rest of the project could proceed as an energy only project due to that small proportional allocation.
Well, are you suggesting that they would reject that small allocation and try again versus accept the small allocation and try for the next cycle?
Well, I think that's what we're looking for clarification on is how is that be treated and would there be a threshold there? If the project only got, a few percent of, its total nameplate as partial capacity, could it then proceed as energy only?
Well, it could for the portion that didn't receive an allocation, but the way the proposal is now, you would have to accept that partial allocation, and you could reseek for the energy-only portion as long as you haven't been converted. Well, it may not be energy-only yet, the portion that doesn't have an allocation. So you'd be able to reseek for the portion that doesn't have an allocation as long as that portion has not been converted to energy-only.
Okay, so maybe I'm just conflating the two things. I mean, let's just pretend it's zero, I guess, for the sake of argument. Would the project still be required to be withdrawn at that point, or would it be converted to energy only?
If the project has exhausted its opportunities to be eligible for Group 4, then the project would be, and it hasn't received an allocation, or it has received an allocation but hasn't retained it, and the 2 years are up, then the project would have to withdraw.
Okay, thank you.
Next we have Alan Combs. Your line is unmuted.
Yeah, hi. Thank you. This is Alan Combs from New Consulting. Just a few questions that I don't think have been asked yet. So on page 10, it said if a project seeking allocation in Group 4 does not receive an allocation, it may be parked if eligible and apply under Group 4 a second time. I just want to clarify that if you're going to allow a Group 4 project to kind of come back a second time, isn't it also eligible to be Group 1 or 2 the second time if it can secure a PPA or shortlist?
Oh, absolutely, yes.
Okay. There was a question about points, different types of PPAs. Points are still used strictly as tiebreakers within a group. Is that right?
Well, I wouldn't necessarily say tiebreakers. I would say for ordering which project is first in line to get the allocation, which is second, and so forth. And as well as if all things are equal, we try to have some tiebreakers to be able to not have ties, because it's the way we do ties right now is you do a prorate across everybody, and that's not really ideal for everybody to get a small portion.
Right. But within a group, it's still strictly all PPAs are ahead of all shortlisting.
That's correct.
All right. These TPD, these 2022, 23 cycle, 2023, 2024 cycles, I just want to make sure I understand this. So a project that today is full capacity, but maybe doesn't get a full allocation, so it either converts to energy only or partial energy only sometime in 2022, would be eligible under this proposal, if it gets approved, to apply for Group 4 in the 2022-2023 cycle, as in the affidavits due this fall and the TPD that's in early 2023?
Yes, that's correct.
Yeah. And then a Cluster 14 project that's following the schedule, they're really, for them, they have no opportunity to participate in this until the 2023-2024 cycle?
That's correct.
All right.
Yeah, all projects must have completed all their studies to be eligible for any allocation group.
Right. And Susan brought this up, but I think the one thing that wasn't said about the retention criteria is right now there is no retention criteria if you're shortlisted, so you're going to have to add that on the retention affidavit. I mean, because that's the.
I guess I'm not.
But that's not accurate. A shortlisted project has to execute by the next year.
So the retention criteria is that you have a PPA. I think you just need to look at the form.
For Group 3, or excuse me, Group 4, you can get you can retain your allocation.
I'm talking about the current structure. If you just look at the retention criteria, the retention is show us your PPA. You may have been shortlisted to get it, but the retention criteria is show us your PPA.
Well, that's for group 2, but in group 3, you have neither a PPA or shortlist when you get your allocation. So in order to retain the allocation you get in group 4, you have to either demonstrate I've got a PPA now, or I've been shortlisted now. And at that point, if you've been shortlisted the following year, you will have to demonstrate an executed PPA.
All right, okay, thank you. That's helpful clarification. And I did have a couple questions about the site control. I apologize, I didn't raise my hand. I can put my hand down now and raise it again if there's some time, or I could just ask it now. I'd hate to kind of go back to that in the middle of your.
Well, is it a quick one?
Well, all right. Well, I'll go ahead and state it. I guess I would just ask the concern that somebody wouldn't go out and seek site control really as not so much as to support the project, but as a way to exit the queue and get their site control deposit back. I mean, I don't think it's too hard to construct some cases where site exclusivity could be just demonstrated, and depending on the standard of care, might be for, maybe in conjunction with a project modification that allows you to exit the queue and get your site control deposit back. But I guess I just asked if you've considered that as a concern.
Yes, and I'd like to, if you would, provide, some examples of how you think it might be easy enough to actually demonstrate site exclusivity to be able to do that, where they wouldn't have done that already. But if there's a way to, we may have to determine what is the minimum criteria for that demonstration to make sure that we really believe they have site exclusivity. But if it's that easy to get, why not demonstrate it and before you withdraw? So if there's something that you could, shine some additional light on that in your comments for us to consider, I'd appreciate that.
We will try to do that. And I guess I'd ask, did you consider, rather than just making the site control deposit refundable upon showing site control, that you simply require that it can't be returned? It could be a contribution to project costs under an executed LGA. Essentially make it can be deployed for the interconnection, so it's refundable in that sense, or but it's only upon execution of an IA.
Yeah, we haven't really considered that. That's something that I would actually want to talk to my accounting group about and find out, is it easy to take funds from one bucket into another, or is it easier just to send it back to the customer?
I think there's precedent for that, funds given I know you have a difference here between PTOs and the CAISO, but the idea that funds contributed can be deployed for the interconnection as opposed to just returned, they do have precedent, and I would argue that that's really the way to.
Okay, well, if you could put that in your comments, Alan, I'd appreciate that.
All right, thank you.
Okay, Bob, we have around 10 minutes for comments. We do have a few folks. We have Betty Fong. Your line is unmuted for your question.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes.
Oh, hi, Bob. So a couple questions here. So say I'm thinking from the 2022 to 2023 cycle, and as well as 2023 to 2024 cycle. Say for the 2022 to 2023 cycle, an EO project comes in as a group 4, does not get TPD because it triggers DNU. Is that required to withdraw based on the requirement for group 4 projects to withdraw? That's the first portion. And the second portion is, think of it from the 2023-2024 cycle. If an EO project or the portion of a project converted to EO after paying the $60,000 study deposit comes back to look for TBD as Group 1 or Group 2 because it secured a PPA, does it not get TBD and does not get TBD because it triggers DNUs, will that project or the portion of that project be required to withdraw? And if so, at what point? Or can you just clarify that any project that is tied to a PPA won't be required to withdraw, even if it triggers the DNU?
Well, what you're stating is a project that does not get an allocation. So, in that first cycle. So if an energy-only project, I would appreciate if you add this to your comments, but, we didn't think about this particular situation, but I would think that we probably wouldn't require a project that's energy-only now. They are eligible for Group 4 that first year, that we wouldn't require it to withdraw.
Okay.
But that's something I think we'll have to have some discussions internally before we actually make a final commitment on that.
Okay.
And then related to a project that is energy only and is being studied to determine if it's behind a deliverability constraint. If a project does not get an allocation in Group 4, and say we didn't require it to withdraw, and it got a PPA or shortlisted the next year, we'd have to do that same study again, and it may come up with the same results or the results may be different. So we'd have to just take it on, year by year basis.
Okay, I can add that. And then building on Susan's question, I kind of want to gauge that the total parking time is the same. Say a scenario is you go in as a Group 4, get nothing, you park, you come back next year with a short list and you go into 1 or 2 and you still get nothing. Can they park again and come back as a 1-2 the next year? Or is the parking time, or is it subject to the same parking as second year eligibility, or is the total parking time still the same?
Yes, there is no change to the eligibility for parking. So if a project wants to park a second year, it would have to, meet the criteria of there's deliverability still in the area that they're in, that they're seeking deliverability for, and they don't have any network upgrades that are shared by others that their parking could actually hinder the other projects moving forward.
Okay, so if they hang on to the PPA somehow, they're not required to withdraw. It's only as a Group 4. If you exhaust it twice, then you have to withdraw. Is that correct?
That's correct. That's correct.
Okay. Okay, that's all I have. Thank you so much, Bob.
We have Patrick Tan. Your line is unmuted.
Yes, this is Patrick Tan from 8 Minute Solar. Can you all hear me?
Yes.
Okay, great. Thank you. Just a couple, one follow-up question to your discussion with Susan regarding for this next coming year that, any projects can try to seek deliverability in Group 4. Do they all require the $60,000 extra cost, and if they're not parked, is that still come into play for this coming year?
Any project that's energy only would have to put in $60,000 deposit to be studied to determine if it would be eligible for an allocation, because it is not behind a deliverability constraint.
Got it. Okay, thanks. And then then I just have two clarifying questions that are hopefully quick. So pretty much any project that goes through Group 4, there's no way for those projects to eventually proceed as energy only, correct? You're just kicked out of the queue?
That's the intention, yes.
Okay, got it. And the other question was, I think it was a follow-up to your discussion with Ian. So it sounds like my interpretation was that corporate PPAs would not be just allowed to try to get deliverability, but it sounds like I'm wrong about that and they're just a lower priority. Is that correct? Versus a load-setting entity?
Well, they are at a lower priority as long as they actually demonstrate that the RA attributes do have a firm contract with an entity that has an RA obligation.
So, Bob, this is Bill. I think to say it clearly, yes, corporate PPAs by themselves are ineligible to seek Group 1. However, if that PPA has its own PPA with an LSC with RA, then it's eligible for Group 1, but under a lower priority.
Thank you. Okay, I think that helps clarify my questions at this time.
I do see one caller on the phone line. As a reminder, you'll hear a notification when your line is unmuted. At that time, please go ahead and proceed with your name and question. Your line has been unmuted.
Yes, hi, Bob. This is Michael Tativi from Terragen. I think thank you first for reinsertion this group for this is going to be helpful. I just have one question. I think partially has been answered, but I just wanted to ask you. So if a project from the previous cluster was allocated deliverability, but it was not able to retain it, and then it will apply in the 2022-2023 process under cluster under the group 4, and if it does not get allocation, and then but however after that it secures a PPA, would it be able to apply on 2023-2024 process?
As long as it has not been converted to energy only.
Well, I mean, because previous cluster it was allocated and then it was revoked because it couldn't retain it, so it became energy only, and so the current status is energy only, but it applies in 2022-2023, and if it doesn't receive it, so you're saying it would not be given another chance, even if it secures the PPA after that.
That's correct. The only thing I would clarify is by losing an allocation, if you had a PPA, but if you show that you have a PPA, there is no further retention. But if you were shortlisted, but were not able to demonstrate that you have an executed PPA in the next year's retention cycle, we don't necessarily just convert you to energy only at that point. If you have an opportunity to park, you could park. But if you are out of parking opportunities, then you would be converted to energy only.
Well, I mean, it was. I think it was a previous clause says it was allocated based on group 3, and it didn't have a PPA, but then it didn't execute the GIA on time, so then basically the allocation was revoked and converted to energy only, and now it applies in 2022-2023, and if it doesn't get allocation in this process, but it's able to, for example, in January 2023, secure the PPA, would it be able to come back into the group and the application in 2023-2024 process, or basically it has to go away?
That project, if it applied to any group in the 2022 cycle, didn't get an allocation, you could come back as an energy only project if you got a PPA the following year. You can come back into group 1, but you have to be studied to determine if you are eligible or not.
Okay. All right. Thank you.
Okay, so one last question. We have 3 minutes. Kathleen, please state your line is unmuted.
Hi, this is Kathleen Colbert from Vistra. I'll be very brief. All the conversation on the call about the PPA and the clarifications that the CAISO is trying to make, I think have highlighted that there's some confusion sometimes between commercial world and kind of how the tariff or the manuals read. I think it will be very helpful if the CAISO clarifies in its next version that when it says PPA, and this may be what you're trying to do, but it might be simpler just to note that PPA could be including both a tolling agreement or a long-term RA agreement with an off-taker, and that might help clarify some, I think, of the confusion. I also note corporate PPA. It's not necessarily like a language that I would use in the commercial space. We would just talk about the type of agreement and who the counterparties are. So I just wanted to note that there may be some ways to simplify that, and we'll try and put it in comments to help make it clear. But I was not interpreting that the CAISO was intending to create different tiers in Group 1 based on if it was truly a tolling agreement versus a long-term RA agreement, and I think that clarity would be helpful.
Okay, appreciate that.
This is Bill. I just want to make 2 points. I mean, you're right that we're only talking about who the off-taker is. When we say corporate PPA, we mean a non-load serving entity. I guess, you know, a customer has load, but it's not reselling that load. It's not reselling energy. Anyways, we mean a large corporate customer that doesn't have an RA obligation. But to your other point, I really don't think you want the CAISO to get into specifying what specific types of quote unquote PPAs will accept. Ultimately, we're just saying, you know, is someone buying your capacity?
And Bill, you've absolutely hit it on the head. We would not like the CAISO to try to identify the commercial agreement types. They can change and they should evolve with the market realities that we experience. I just was reading the language in the paper and noting that the way you're framing it as a PPA versus a contract that has RA attributes kind of is already dipping into that a bit from the way I read it. So just caution to maybe take another look.
Yeah, that's fair. I mean, I think a lot of this will get flushed out in the tariff language process, hopefully.
All right, thank you. I think it's time to move on to the next slide.
Other residual issues?
Yes, yeah, slide 13. Okay, oh, you're in actually slide 14 already. Okay, thank you. So these are other residual issues, part of the draft final proposal. So this topic is the expanded error and emissions process, and the draft final proposal did include a few modifications to this, nothing really major, but a few. So the first bullet is unchanged, that after a project's due date for its second interconnection financial security posting, any cost responsibility increase associated with an error emission on the part of the PTO would be the responsibility of PTO. That's unchanged. And then this next section, there's been some adjustments made in a couple areas. So after a project has made its first or second posting, if an error emission is discovered, that would have the project would have an option to accept those changes and move forward with the changes, or to withdraw. That's unchanged. Projects withdrawn projects would receive a full refund of its IFS and any unused study deposit when the following criteria are met. And this criteria is already existing in Appendix DD, Section 6.8.1, and we'll be doing some modifications to this. So this section is on the what is a substantial error emission. And originally we had proposed that if the cost increase was 10% or more, then they would be eligible to withdraw and get their posting back. Based on some good comments from Edison, we decided let's just use this existing language and not change it. So we're going to have the language where you would be eligible if the cost increase was 5% or $1 million, whichever is greater. So that is going to be the threshold on the cost side of it to be able to receive a refund of your posting. And then result in delay of the project, either its earliest achievable in service date or the DNU required in service date if those are delayed by more than 1 year. So that's basically the same as before. And then based on our request for comments and the comments we did receive related to if a customer loses its PPA due to these issues, it would also be eligible to receive that refund of its posting. However, we would need to have some specific documentation related to that, and that documentation is described in the paper. So with that, I'll open it up for questions.
I do see one caller in the queue. Sam, please go ahead. Your line is unmuted. Please unmute the device from your end and proceed with your question.
Apologies.
Your line has been unmuted.
Thank you. Thank you. Sorry, Sam Bustillos, STG&E. We just noticed in the updated proposal that there's pretty specific items that are listed in referencing where that 1 year delay comes from. And we'll put it in comments, but it just seems that we should probably leave out the specificity that you put in there because we have date changes that happen via an MMA, maybe a facilities reassessment report, technical reports, and either we'll put a couple different proposals in our comments, but either it really should list every type of date change that could happen and be reported through the different processes, or just should be based on whatever the latest date is. So just that's all the comments. Thanks.
Okay. Yeah, I would appreciate those comments.
Moving on to the next caller. Bindavani Malladi, please go ahead. Your line is unmuted.
Thank you. This is Brenda Malladi from Ariwan. My question is, how would an interconnection customer know that the cost increase is due to an error or omission and not a scope change?
Well, typically, a scope change would be the result of a customer making a change. Am I not correct? And so the error or omission, it has to be due to a PTO.
No, I was talking in reference to an increase in upgrade cost from a PTO.
Right. So, I mean, I guess I'd have to understand what you mean by scope change.
So let's just assume that PTO proposes a terminal upgrade initially and then increases the scope to maybe adding a substation, and thereby increasing the upgrade cost. How would we know that this could be an error too, that the PTO missed it, that the terminal upgrade was not possible in the beginning and a substation replacement is the only option, and that probably was missed in the beginning. But there is no way for us to know that this change is an error on PTO's part.
Well, I think in that case, I would say that it is, that if the PTO studied your project to interconnect to a particular substation, but it turns out that that substation cannot accommodate that interconnection, then it would be an error omission. I guess we'd have to look at the specific, behind the actual circumstances. So, there may be a bit of on a case-by-case basis, but.
Okay.
Yeah, I would say the opposite. It's never a case-by-case basis, right? It doesn't need to be a per se error. Someone made a mistake, spilled coffee on their keyboard, because if it's not, it's just an omission. I mean, any change that wasn't precipitated by an interconnection customer change after that point is considered an error omission.
Okay, yeah, that's helpful. That's helpful. Okay, thank you.
Yeah, I mean, the only caveat to that would be, if system changes occur that precipitated something like this.
Okay.
But that's pretty rare.
Okay. Thank you.
I do not see any callers in the queue as of now.
Okay, well, I'll then turn it over to Linda.
All right, good morning. Clarifying the definition of a reliability network upgrade. This proposal is being maintained that a RAS is always considered a reliability network upgrade, whether it's identified in the reliability or the deliverability portion of the study. Congestion management cannot be utilized in place of a RAS needed for deliverability, and that is why a RAS as an RNU is identified. IRs for each RAS are grouped together pursuant to the tariff, and the cost for the RAS as an RNU is allocated to the corresponding electrical group. And the RNU costs will continue to be included in the RNU cost allocation and eligible for cash reimbursement. Are there any questions?
I do not see any callers in the queue.
All right, so I will move on to transferring PTO wholesale distribution access tariff projects into the ISO queue. This proposal also remains unchanged and just formalizes this type of exchange that has taken place in the past. The definition of transferring will be documented in the tariff language for this initiative as a project that has submitted to a PTO during a cluster window is found to have requested a transmission level POI. The project will be accepted by the ISO into its queue for study in the same cluster. The criteria will be developed between the PTOs and the ISO, including the timing around when this type of transfer can occur. There was a request from stakeholders that information regarding substation and line operational control be made public. And the ISO will work with PTOs to see if this information can be made public. That would help deter this from even being an issue at all. The PTOs will have to decide if they will include a reciprocal process for IRs with a distribution level POI that gets submitted to the ISO, if they can be transferred from the ISO's queue to the PTO's queue for the same cluster. Any questions on this one?
Yes, I do see a caller in the queue. Sam, please go ahead. Your line is unmuted.
Yes, Sam Bustillos, SDG&E again. Just it seemed that based on the comments and things from this last proposal that, and maybe just help us understand, it seemed that this is more of a fix for maybe an issue that exists today, rather than maybe a future improvement. Well, it is a future improvement, but it's specifically to fix an issue today where maybe ICs inadvertently submit projects to the wrong application. We're just, we asked for the definition, appreciate you providing that with the draft tariff language, but I just wanted to try to understand a little bit more of kind of the background of this.
Right. In the past, we're just trying to formalize what has happened in the past when during a cluster window, an interconnection request has been received, like if someone submits to San Diego with a POI that happens to be actually at the transmission level and needs to come to the ISO, that we would accept transferring that over into the cluster, that same cluster for study. And the request from stakeholders have more information regarding the substation and line operational control being made public. That would actually help alleviate this being an issue up front and get in front of the issue. But as it stands now, that information isn't available, and sometimes there is applications made to the wrong entities. And like I say, if it goes to the WDAT and should be transmission, the ISO is willing to accept those in the same cluster for study.
Perfect. Thank you very much for that clarification. Makes a lot better sense to us now. And, I think that maybe it's a non-issue for San Diego since all of our transmissions under ISO control, but can understand for some of the other PTOs. So appreciate that. Thank you.
Thanks, sure, Sam.
I do not see any other callers in the queue as of now.
All right. The next initiative was changing sites and POIs during the IR validation. This proposal also remains unchanged. Limiting a change of POI for a project within the 5 business days of the scoping meeting to within the same transmission study area as the originally requested POI was supported in the stakeholder comments that we received. Project site changes in 5 business days following the scoping meeting would only be allowed in conjunction with a permissible change of POI and limited to the same transmission study area as the originally requested POI. This initiative only addresses changes in the site and POI during the IR validation process. The ability to request a change later via the MMA process is unchanged. The ISO will work with the PTOs to define the terms same transmission area and also transmission study area, and also see if a publicly available map clearly showing the boundaries can be made available. Are there any questions?
Yes, I do see a caller in the queue. Susan Schneider, please go ahead. Your line is unmuted.
Hi, Susan Schneider, Phoenix Consulting. Just a quick question. Is it somehow controversial when you're looking at when you call something a transmission area or transmission study area, or it seems like there must have been something in mind when these things were put out. But is there some some odd thing about just defining what you mean when you say that, or how it is you assess that? I just was. It seems strange that this has gone a couple of iterations now without, and then now there has to be consultation with the PTOs about what this means. Can you just sort of talk about, is there some issue with that, or is there some lack of clarity in the study process, or what's going on with that?
It was requested clarification stakeholder. So the transition study, as you know, as in the PG&E and in the ST areas, there's many sub-study areas, and those are the areas that we are referring to, but we will work on defining the terms specifically so people understand the same thing that we do.
Okay, might we see that? Oh, go ahead, sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt.
And also, if we're able to get a map out there, that having that visual will be definitely helpful.
I agree. That would be very helpful. Might we see that information? And I think there is a provision. Oh, I know we're probably talking about next steps at the end, but I think there's a provision for revised draft final or something. Might we see that in that next iteration, perhaps?
Well, we're going to be working with the PTOs on those terms, so possibly. But we also, I guess, if they're going to be defined terms, will be part of the tariffs.
Okay, okay, so that would be something we would see before the board meeting then, at least.
Yes.
Yeah. Okay. All right. Thank you.
Moving on to the next caller, Patrick Tan. Please go ahead. Your line is unmuted.
Hi, Linda. Just a quick clarification question that I'm not sure if this was discussed in a previous meeting, but just on the last bullet here, this just applies during the validation process. This isn't saying that we can never change our site after the scoping meeting, like a year later, right?
That is correct. We mentioned that the ability to change that information or change later via the MMA process is unchanged. That's still available to you. This just speaks to the 5 days following the scoping meeting when you confirm your POI for study.
Great. Thanks, Linda.
I do not see any other callers in the queue as of now.
Thank you.
All right, thank you, Linda. This is Jason Foster with the queue management team here at the ISO. The question on this slide is whether allowing parked projects to submit MMAs, and the draft final proposal is essentially allowing 3 different changes to be submitted as an MMA if a project is parked, downsizing, and then fuel type or technology changes, as well as POI changes. The key here is if a project is requesting an MMA while they are parked, in addition to the $10,000 MMA deposit, the project would also need to fund its second financial security posting in order to proceed with that MMA. And then additionally, if needed, to clarify that a project could park for a second year if it meets that certain criteria. I'll pause there for any questions.
I do see a couple of callers in the queue. Moving on to the first caller. Susan Schneider, please go ahead. Your line is unmuted.
Hi, just a really quick question. I know that right now, in order to get a draft GIA, a project has to come out of parking and make that second financial security posting. Now, if they're making the second financial security posting anyway because they're putting in an MMA request while they're in parking, could they request a draft GIA, or do they still have to come out of parking to do that?
Good clarification. I'm not sure we have a specific answer. My quick assessment would be no, they would need to come out of parking to proceed with the GIA.
Okay, we'll put that in comments, but it seems like the big deal was having to make the posting to show you were serious, and so maybe you could consider that, but we'll put it in comments. Thanks.
Great, thanks, Susan.
Moving on to the next caller. Sam, please go ahead. Your line is unmuted.
Hi, yeah, Sam Bustillos, SDG&E. So we're just having trouble understanding the modification to include POI changes during parking. it seemed that the intent of this proposal was to limit the, the impact or the type of changes that would be allowed for MMAs during parking. And it seems that POI changes is a pretty significant change to be allowed during the MMA. And the other difficulty with this is that the way that the tariff is written and the reference to the sections of tariff under 6.7.2 for modifications really falls under, activities of the phase 1 study and talks about changes that are allowable from phase 1 to phase 2 where projects are allowed to change their POI. It just seems that after that, unless it continues to have the stipulation that we don't see an impact on cost or reliability for those POI changes, then we're just not seeing that MMAs are even a time when POI changes are allowed. And maybe we're just not interpreting the tariff correctly, but maybe you can help us understand a little better.
Yeah, thanks, Sam. I think you raised a good point here. I tend to agree with you that, generally a POI change, at least as we've seen in the past, has impacted cost or benefit to either the existing or other parties. And I think that would be part of this evaluation of whether that POI change would be approved in this MMA request or a given MMA request. More or less, if the PTO and the CAISO are seeing cost or benefit impacts or negative impacts, let's say, then the MMA request and the POI change request would then be declined. It'd be great to hear that or see that comment and suggestion in writing, and the CAISO can respond to it formally.
Sure, happy to put it in comments. I'm just hoping that ISO will reconsider the inclusion of POI changes during this MMA. Even making that assessment of whether that represents an impact, still represents a good amount of work from the PTO side, and we'd like to see that, again, the intent to be followed through here, which is to, limit the impactful MMAs through while projects are parked. So we'll definitely put that into comments.
Sure.
I do not see any other callers in the queue as of now.
All right. Yep. So continuing on, wanted to make a clarification for modifications to commercial viability criteria. Commercial viability criteria. Essentially, the CAISO is clarifying here that the commercial viability criteria requirements only apply when an interconnection customer submits a modification request to delay beyond the 7-year mark in the queue. And if a PTO or non-IC trigger is causing a delay, that the CDC requirements would not apply. The key and the caveat there is if further delays are requested beyond that 7 or 8 year mark following a PTO or non-IC delay, that CVC would be required if requested by the customer. I'll pause there for questions.
I do see one caller in the queue. Susan Schneider, please go ahead. Your line is unmuted.
Hi, just a quick one. When you've talked about this in the past, you always put that last bullet in there, and I'm not really sure what is that last bullet intended to communicate. We understand that if the PTO, and again, it's not attributing fault to the PTO delays. It's not their fault or they're not trying. It's just, if the equipments are not there or something like that, or there's, permitting takes longer than expected and the PTO, it's the part that the PTO is doing. But what is this last bullet actually intended to mean? That if a standard changes and that's the reason for a delay, is there some implication of that's not a PTO delay, or what are you intending to connotate with this last bullet here?
Yeah, Susan, my understanding of that last standards need to continually change and evolve. I believe there was, or at least my understanding of this, the intent of this bullet is there was some indication or request at some point where the CAISO work with all the PTOs to create a standard process for how and what triggers PTO delays. And I think the intent here is to say that, you know, the CAISO and I think PTOs are not going to delineate between the various standards and the differences between the PTO standards and requirements, and that we're basically going to leave each PTO independent from each other and say, you know, SCE may determine a PTO delay to mean, you know, this, and this is how it's applied, and PG&E may have something similar or slightly different than that.
Well, that seems like a very different thing from standards. I mean, so are you saying that each PTO can define a PTO delay as it wishes, and there's not going to be some standard treatment under the tariff, or that there's not consistent treatment across PTOs? What is that? What that means?
Hey, Jason, yeah, this is Bill. I mean, I think the short answer is no.
Yeah.
Like I said to the earlier question, anything that is, on errors and omissions, anything that isn't precipitated by an interconnection customer modification is going to be a PTO delay. I thought the intent of that last bullet was just saying that more frequently, you know, changing reliability standards has become the cause of these PTO delays, rather than, you know, construction or procurement delays. But yeah, no, we certainly take an incredibly broad view of anything that's PTO caused.
Okay, so I mean, the last statement sort of taken in isolation seems obvious. Yes, of course, standards need to continually change, you know, blah, 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 NERC standards, all that stuff. But that's not different between PTOs, and that doesn't change what you just said, which is basically if it's not something that a customer initiated, then it's going to count as a PTO delay. Again, not because it's their fault or anything, but just because there are these changing standards. So you're not meaning to change the definition just with this last bullet, right?
No.
Yeah.
Okay.
Or yes, right.
Okay, it's a little confusing, and maybe you could say, but we don't mean to change, you know, the definitions or something every time you say this. So, okay, well, thank you for the clarification. I do appreciate it.
Thanks, Susan.
I do not see any other callers in the queue as of now.
Okay, great, thanks. The last of my slides is expanding deliverability transfer opportunities here. And really, we're proposing to revise the tariff section to allow deliverability transfers to be at the same substation and voltage level instead of the exact point of interconnection or bay position, if you will, within the substation. Pretty short and sweet. I'll open it for questions. Okay, great. I think we can keep going.
I do not see any callers in the queue as of now.
This is Jason. Am I doing this slide too? I apologize. Wasn't prepared for this one, but I can if we need to. Okay, hearing nothing, I'll run with it. So there was a recommendation and suggestion for the CAISO to include, following the IR validation and through various processes, to include documentation and RIMs. And we're proposing to provide and insert kind of concluded documentation into RIMs following those given processes. And the examples here would be deliverability allocation results, financial security posting requests and results, MMA documentation, as well as documentation for repowers and limited operation studies. Any questions? Okay, great, thanks. Linda?
Thanks, Jason. So the last initiative I'm speaking about is adding the due dates for curing deficiencies in Appendix Bs. And this item data validation deadline of 70 calendar days following the issuance of the Phase 1 study report. Comments received for adding these due dates for curing the Appendix B were almost all in support, and the proposal remains unchanged. Projects that are not valid in the 70 calendar days from the Phase 1 report would be issued a deemed withdrawn notification that would have a 5 business day cure. This initiative provides a minimum of 35 calendar days for a project to have its Appendix B validated. Adding the validation date based on the results meeting for each project was suggested by some, but it's not only administrative burden, but it also has the potential to burden technical resources of both the ISO and the PTO due to the tariff requirement to complete results meetings within 30 calendar days from the issuance of the Phase 1 study report. The determination of a deadline for Appendix B is also part of our transparent stakeholder process and would be filtered through all of our other documentation, such as the Appendix DD, our BPM, customer guidelines, and all of our meeting minutes, and addressed at the Resource Interconnection Fair. Any questions?
I do see a caller in the queue. Susan Schneider, please go ahead. Your line is unmuted.
Hey, Linda, I'm not picking on you today, I promise. But I do have a quick question here. You know, LSA had complained about this and didn't think it was fair because there are projects that are earlier in the queue because you have a set date for the end date here. The projects that are earlier in the queue would have more time to before that date comes up. So I guess that since we haven't gotten any traction on that, I'm just wondering, how does the CAISO, maybe a broader question was, how does the CAISO decide how to sequence its results meetings? Is it anything that a customer can influence?
Well, I mean, if the customer is going to have some unavailability, we always appreciate hearing about that in advance of setting our meetings, because we have so many meetings and we have customers who have projects sometimes in multiple PTO areas. So it's quite a puzzle getting it all figured out so that there's no overlap and that everybody gets handled within the 30 calendar days. So, you know, whether and actually in the 30 calendar days, you know, we don't start right at the beginning. We give people time to digest their results and to provide comments back to us for the meetings. So, and also since our resources are all focused on the meeting, then the actual review process, just because you have an earlier meeting doesn't mean that you're going to get your comments back like right away. The turn might not be as quick, with the focus might be being more towards once the meetings are completed, or at least for that study area, then those resources will be available to, you know, sort through the submissions of the Appendix Bs and get that information back. So even if you had it on the very last day of our 30 calendar days for our meeting, you would have 35 calendar days still to get your Appendix B validated, even before we had implemented the 3.8 deemed withdrawn, if it's still hung out there, which would add 10 more business days, which is 14 calendar days. So.
Right. No, I think I understand the valid that calendar, but I'm just wondering, like, how do you decide who goes first?
Excuse me, one more time.
Well, how do you decide who goes? So yeah, you're right. It's 30 days, but then you can't, you know, do it the day after the studies go out. So maybe you're looking at 3 weeks, maybe, or something. But how do you decide who goes first in that progression of the big mess that comes after that?
It all revolves around the availability. You know, our resources, our engineers are, you know they have to be available during that time, and we put the schedule together. We don't. I can't say there's a science to it. We just go and we work with each other to make sure, like I say, that we keep people with multiple projects, make sure they don't have conflicting meetings, and so there's not like a pecking order or anything like that. It's just how it comes together.
Okay. So no algorithm or any, you know, we always take the people in the north first, or we always do the big projects first or the small projects first. Nothing like that.
No.
Okay.
Nothing fancy.
Oh. Okay. All right. Thank you very much.
Uh-huh.
I do not see any other callers in the queue as of now.
Thank you.
All right, thanks, Linda. This is Bob. This is my slide. Or this is related to the requirements for IRs that are proposing to utilize a third-party Gentai. And we did make some modifications in the draft final proposal, and those modifications were all related to what the requirements are for cluster 14. So for cluster 14, we did kind of scale this back a little bit, where in order to enter the phase 2 study, we will require a letter of intent, which is a letter that you have an agreement with the third-party owned equipment, whatever that may be, that they are willing to negotiate with you. So that's going to be required to enter into phase 2. And then the full-blown executed Gentai sharing agreement will be required following the phase 2 studies, and that will be due at the time the second interconnection financial security posting is due. And then the next two main bullets are not changed at all, where for cluster 15 and beyond, will require a letter of intent with the IR submittal and require the executed Gentai sharing agreement to proceed into the phase 2 studies. And that would be due, excuse me, be due at the time the ISSS posting is due for that project to go into phase 2. And then for a request for project modification, Gentai sharing arrangements requested in conjunction with a request to modify the project, the ISO would require an executed Gentai sharing agreement to proceed with the MMA. So with that, I'll open it up for questions.
As a reminder, you may enter the question queue by using the raise hand icon located just above the chat panel. You'll hear a beep tone when your line is unmuted. At that time, please state your name and question. If you're not connected to the WebEx audio and you're just on the phone line, please press #2 on your phone keypad to enter the question queue. You'll hear a notification when your line is unmuted. At that time, please state your name and question. I do not see any callers in the queue as of now.
Great. So as far as next steps
actually, I'm sorry, but right now I see a caller who just came into the queue. Would you like to take their question?
Yep, let's go ahead and take the question.
Okay, sure. Abhishek. Abhishek Singh, please go ahead. Your line is unmuted.
Bob, this is Abhishek from Rev Renewables. Great presentation. I'm glad to see this. Great. Yeah, this is great, and glad to see this coming along so well. I had a question about one of the stakeholders suggested items, and I know we certainly appreciated KAISO including our item, which basically talked about an NTP, notice to proceed, triggering PTO's planning for upgrades, and that included shared upgrades as well. I saw that item in the revised straw proposal that came out January 25th, but I don't see it in this current proposal. So is the plan now to tackle it as part of phase 2 initiative process? Is that the intention here?
I am actually having to look in the paper to tell you that's not my topic. I don't know if anybody knows the answer to that off the top of their head. I don't know if that item actually got dropped or if it is part of phase 2. Regardless, phase 2 topics we're not addressing in the draft final proposal. So if it's associated with something that's going to be in phase 2, we didn't want to clog this paper up because pretty quickly we'll be going to the board with these items. So we wanted to really focus on these. So the phase 2 items will be, as Danielle said earlier, I think June 5th we'll be coming up with our draft final proposal for the phase 2 items. And whether that item was included, will be included, or if we decided to drop it from the process, I'm not sure. I'll see if I can find it quickly. I don't know if anybody on the call knows, but I'm sure if you go through the paper, you'll be able to find it.
Yeah, it was included as it was tagged as a phase 1 item in the revised draw proposal. So that's why I was kind of not sure on if it get dropped altogether. Was that an omission? So would certainly appreciate confirmation about that.
Okay, so this was related to notice to proceed. Do you recall what topic number that was?
Yeah, I can quickly pull that up.
Abhishek, this is Danielle. So yes, you're correct. This item was included in the revised draft proposal. I think it's under section 6.8. And our plan is to address this issue as part of the transmission grid data transparency topic, which we're hosting a separate stakeholder call or stakeholder workshop on April 5th. So that topic will be included in that discussion.
Okay, that's good to know, Danielle. So I did read Kaiso's comment about how it's going to get tackled through that forum. I still feel it doesn't satisfy what we are looking for, but yeah, certainly open to bringing that up in that call. I guess that's scheduled for April 6th, right?
April 5th, yes.
Okay, sounds good. I'll wait for that. Thank you.
I do not see any callers in the queue as of now.
Okay, great. Well, I think with that, as far as next steps go, I really appreciate everyone's attendance today on the call. We are asking for stakeholder comments due on March 31st, so 1 week from today. I recognize that this is a tight timeline to get comments in. However, we are taking these issues to the May Board of Governors so we can implement them and expect a FERC order by the end of the summer. So we really appreciate everyone's feedback and written comments by March 31st. And like I mentioned to Abhishek, we are hosting the Data Transparency Stakeholder Workshop on April 5th. And we are looking to post the draft tariff language shortly after. And then as far as the phase 2 issue goes, please note that we are planning on posting the draft final proposal specific to those topics on June 7th. So, and I see there's a couple questions in the queue, so why don't we go ahead and take those?
Sure. Susan Schneider, please go ahead. Your line is unmuted.
Yeah, Susan Schneider, Phoenix Consulting. I guess I have to do my usual begging here with 1 week of for comments for all of these topics. In particular, I think you could see the very extensive discussion on Group 4 today, and a lot of information that came out. I think is particularly for those of us representing large groups, that is really a super, super challenge, but especially with the weekend in between. Is there any way to eke out a few more days on that one? I know the proposal was a little bit late. It was supposed to be out on the 10th, and we appreciate that because it looks like this was actually a very good document in terms of reviewing everyone's comments and responding to them. So we do appreciate that and glad you took the time to do that. But it really leaves us a little bit in the lurch with just a week, really literally 5 business days to put together comments on all of these items. So if there's any way to get a few more days out of that, we sure would appreciate that.
Thanks, Susan, and I will take that back to the team and review it internally, see if we can adjust the dates accordingly. But for right now, I think the 31st is the date we're holding to, but we'll see what we can do.
Okay, really appreciate that. Thank you.
Yeah, Susan, this is Bob. Just to kind of manage expectations there. The May board meeting, I believe, is on the 12th, and if we don't get comments back pretty quickly, we're just not going to be able to do anything to get them into another, our final proposal. So we need to get the comments turned around very quickly so that if we need to make some changes to the proposal, that we can do it before the board meeting.
Okay, and we do have, it looks like there's a final proposal, so there'll be another call and maybe opportunity to talk. So we understand, and we understand the constraint. So, and if you can do anything, great, we appreciate it. And, if you can, thank you.
And this is Bob. There's a question about, can we get the recording for this up and posted as soon as possible? That was a request that was made earlier this week, so I did request that take place, that we would make all efforts to get this the recording of this posted, because some people weren't able to attend the stakeholder call at this time. So we will do our best to do that.
Going on to the next caller. Arash Gotsian, please go ahead. Your line is unmuted.
Good morning. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Great. Yeah. Excuse me. This is Arash Gotsian with EDF Renewables. I guess first I want to thank you all for the presentation and adjustment to the proposals. This has been very helpful discussion. The general question I have, I mean, as part of the queue enhancement process that you guys are leading, at what point does CAISO think that they will be revisiting the actual process itself and the timeline associated with the studies that are being performed? Have you guys given that any thoughts? Obviously, we had included that in the past comments, and with the changes that we're seeing in the industry taking place in other markets, kind of wondering, what is the thought process from a long-term perspective from your end as to, potential transition to the three-phase approach and revisiting the timeline of the studies that are being done? So just kind of, curious, has there been any discussion on, internally regarding that?
This is Bob. I'll take the first shot at that. Our process is a very integrated process. The interconnection process is very integrated with the transmission planning process and vice versa. And so much of the information that is studied in various studies gets passed back and forth on very tight timelines. And if we make an adjustment to the interconnection process, then timelines for studies, then we have to make adjustments to the transmission planning process. And at this point, we're pretty much locked into the process the way it is working right now. It's working pretty well. I mean, we ran into a kind of an unexpected situation with cluster 14. We're trying to address some of the reasons why we think we got so many projects in cluster 14 and along with even working with the PUC that, they won't release procurement of very large amounts after a long lull, that it'll be, more information coming out and more gradual for these kind of things to occur, to where hopefully we won't see another cluster 14 situation again. We really think our cluster and two-phase process works well. We haven't seen, we haven't come up internally or heard from any external party of any means to do a better job of it, to actually move the sheer number of projects that through the cluster study process that we do. So at this point, we're not really looking at making significant changes to our study process, even as we looked at the ANOPR that FERC had out for the interconnection process. We considered a number of alternative ways of dealing with things, and some of those will actually be dealt with in phase 2 to see if there's something that might be able to be utilized in a different fashion to help the overall process be improved. But I don't think that we have any intention of really changing the base structure of the interconnection process.
So Bob, the hope and the intention is that as we move forward, there wouldn't be, the backlog will be cleared and it will be managed, right? With some of these changes, that's your anticipation, correct?
Well, when you say backlog, I don't know that I would frame that we have a backlog.
Okay.
We have a cluster 14 that's very large that did get the schedule adjusted to be able to accommodate that sheer number of projects. But I don't consider that a backlog. They're on schedule, they're moving forward, and they're on the timeline that is in the tariff. So I don't see that the ISO actually has a backlog of projects.
Okay. Great, thank you.
Moving on to the next caller. Sam, please go ahead. Your line is unmuted.
Hi, thanks. Sam Bustillos, STG&E. Just wanted to confirm one item that wasn't on the list in the latest proposal was the treatment for IRNUs across clusters. Just wanted to confirm that didn't end up dropping off as a proposal and is going to be a phase 2 item.
Yes, it is.
Thank you.
We have, got the stakeholder input from the draft final proposal that discussed that. Also looking at getting some additional information from Edison that proposed that particular item. So we will hopefully have something to propose for the draft final proposal that is in line with all that information that we've received.
Great, thank you.
I do not see any other callers in the queue as of now.
Okay, great. Well, I will pass it over to Brenda for the final slide, and really appreciate everyone's attendance today and feedback, and we look forward to getting those written comments in.
Thank you, Danielle. So for our final slide that we have here to share is that this is just a hyperlink that is also posted on the website for that Interconnection Process Enhancements 2021 webpage. As well, feel free to message us through email to the ISO Stakeholder Affairs at ISO.com. Lastly, thank you all for joining today's discussion. As a reminder, this meeting is recorded for informational and convenience purposes only. The video file will be expedited and posted on the initiative website for a limited time after this meeting. But before we close today's meeting, the ISO is pleased to announce that this year's Stakeholder Symposium will be held in person at the State Credit Union Convention Center in downtown Sacramento on November 9th and 10th of 2022. Registration will open around May, so a public notice will be issued once that site is available. Additionally, information about the Stakeholder Symposium webpage is on the ISO website. As well, you can message us through email on the symposium registration at ISO.com. Again, thank you all for joining today's discussion. We look forward to receiving your comments on the draft final proposal by the end of day, March 31st, and have a great rest of your day. Operator, now you may conclude our call.
Thanks, Brenda. That concludes our conference. Thank you for using Event Services. You may now disconnect.